Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to a Table Talk, a conversation on race. It is so good to be with everyone on this beautiful Wednesday afternoon. Today is April 26, 2023, and my name is Erwin Lopez, and I am the co-chair of the Beloved Community Team, which works alongside the Bishop's Anti-Racist Task Force. And we're so excited to be hosting our speaker today and to be having this very important conversation on racialized trauma and its impact on mental health. I've been trying to bring awareness to racialized trauma because I've been doing some of that work myself. And I'm excited to have the speaker who's actually my counselor. And she's been helping me work through some of the trauma that I've experienced since childhood. And I can't wait for you to hear her. And I hope that these conversations ultimately lead to a racial trauma retreat. So we're really excited I'm really excited about today's podcast, about today's episode. As a reminder, the goal of our table talks is to bring awareness to the anti-racism work in the Florida Conference, to support you as you integrate anti-racism into your ministry, into your lives. And ultimately, we believe this is an act of discipleship. This is how we love God and we love neighbor. So as a reminder, today's topic is an introduction to racialized trauma and its impact on mental health. Our speaker is Kathleen Joseph. She's a licensed mental health counselor who's been in private practice since 2015. Using her experience as a Black woman and her training at the intersection of race and sex, Kathleen creates a safe space for women to discuss lived experiences authentically in therapy contexts so they can get the treatment they deserve. She specializes in somatic therapy. She's a trained practitioner, and she utilizes various somatic-based modalities and aid clients who have endured trauma to function with greater resilience and ease. She's passionate about addressing issues affecting traditionally marginalized populations in the counseling context, and she finds deep meaning from this work. She was trained at the University of Florida, where she received her master's in education, and she's also an education specialist in mental health counseling. And she has additional certificates from the University of Florida Center for Spirituality and Health. Prior to being a licensed mental health counselor, Kathleen has worked for various social service community-based agencies, including the Partnership for Strong Families, Meridian Behavioral Health Care, and the Alachua County Sheriff's Office. She's a creator of the Brain Power program at Girls Place Incorporated, which is a mental health program designed to serve the young women of girls' places and their families. Ooh, this is a handful. She does a lot. We're so blessed to have her today. And she serves on the board of the Education Foundation of Alachua County, whose mission is to support teachers through grants and professional development, and students through senior scholarships and through the Take Stock in Children mentoring program. So we're really excited to have Kathleen Joseph today talk to us about racialized trauma and its impact on mental health. So Kathleen, thank you so much for coming today and for being a part of our conversation.
Thank you so much, Erwin, for having me.
Yeah. So the floor is yours. Share with us your knowledge, and we're excited to hear from you.
Thank you. So I think to start the conversation, I want to just operationalize what trauma is. It's useful to consider what we're talking about when we talk about the trauma experience in general, so that we can get a better understanding of what racialized trauma is and how racialized trauma can impact long-term mental health. So what is trauma? I'm going to give you a very simplified definition. Trauma is anything that happens to us too fast, too soon, or too much for our bodies to integrate or for our bodies to respond to successfully. We experience stress events all the time, right? You may be driving to work one day and someone just cuts in front of you, and all of a sudden you get sort of the telltale signs that you're feeling stressed. Your heart rate starts to increase. Maybe you feel your hands shaking on the steering wheel. You may have a verbal reaction, hey, watch where you're going. These types of things. All of those are characteristic responses of our body's threat detection system being activated. That's our nervous system. Our nervous system's job is to basically keep us alive by being able to identify threats as soon as they become available or sort of recognizable to us, and then to sort of help ourselves to move out of that threat situation. So that's stress. When we look at trauma, trauma is like if we were to kind of turn the radio or the volume knob up, trauma is stress that happened too fast, too soon, too much, in a way that our bodies could not integrate, or we could not successfully get ourselves out of the situation. Our body goes to one of four, and some researchers think there's a fifth, one of four places when we're stressed out to the point of like that, active, oh my gosh, it happened really suddenly and I'm sort of just responding or maybe not being able to respond. We tend to fight, we tend to flee, or we tend to freeze. Those are sort of the three. The fourth one is something called fawning, which in my experience, and the research supports this, is often seen in women. It's the act of smiling and maybe becoming more pleasing in a threatening situation. And so it's me, I'm just kind of profusely smiling, maybe as my boss is screaming at me, or if my heart is racing, but I'm smiling and I'm just kind of trying to appear non-threatening. That actually is a stress response that the nervous system has adapted to going into, because we have a catalog of history as humans that there's an efficacy there. There's an opportunity that our bodies might be able to get out of that threatening situation by smiling. The fifth one is, some researchers talk about it, is a phenomenon called flooding. And we've all probably encountered this when we have encountered something that felt so great and so stressful that we sort of unraveled. We may have been talking incoherently. We may have oscillated between spacing out, which is dissociation, and I can come back to that, and being present. We may have started fights with people. We may have gotten actually into physical fights. This is basically our body going into sort of a larger systemic overwhelmed state. So those are the 5 responses that happen when we're stressed out. Many of us have trauma histories, or let me just say it this way, many of us have histories where even though our body went into one of those 5 responses, we were not able to extricate ourselves from the threat. Maybe we were assaulted. Maybe someone did, in fact, scream at us and humiliate us in front of our peers. Maybe we lived in a home where there was repeated physical or verbal violence, and we were not able to flee. In these situations, we must consider that the individual who encountered that over and over again has a trauma history. That individual has, or I should say that individual's body system has gone into one of these responses and was not able to get away. And if we take that another layer forward, we have individuals who've endured that repeatedly, right? Maybe mom and dad solved problems through physical fights, right? Maybe a parent was a victim of violence. Maybe a parent was an alcoholic and they became incredibly hostile or unpredictable when they were drinking, and that was a regular occurrence. And so when that happens in this repeated fashion, we sort of live there in that response. We sort of adapt. We sort of become individuals who really, as a way of dealing with their situations, really sort of lend towards this higher kind of response that is a sort of, I don't want to say systematized trauma response, but it's certainly a more chronic response. And so when we look at individuals who have endured trauma, maybe endured repeated trauma, this is the individual maybe who had a parent who was an alcoholic and that parent became unpredictable. We see individuals who begin to fashion their lives and their existence around that threat, right? Because going back to my original thesis, our nervous system, our threat detection system, their job, our threat detection system's job is to identify a threat as soon as possible so that we can disposition ourselves away from that threat, defend ourselves from that threat. And so as you probably imagine, as this becomes standard practice of maybe mom, having excessive amount of beverages, drinks, and acting in ways that feels reckless or dangerous for the child begins to adapt, right, to that reality. Maybe the child learns that there are certain things that are not allowed to be said. Maybe the child understands, well, at nighttime, bad things happen. The kind of code that after 8 p.m., my body just kind of naturally rises into this hypervigilance state. And I'm sort of that person. And so at nighttime, I maybe become more stressed. It's harder for me to sleep, as you probably imagine, if this person is carrying that stress. So over time, this person begins to adapt characteristics. And this is interesting because I have actually served individuals who have lived in those experiences, and those experiences have become so normalized. This is just how it is. This is just how parents are, right? Or this is just how people are. That when we sit down together and begin to unpack, hey, gosh, it sounds like this has been your experience in childhood, and this is sort of how you sort of respond in relationships to others. Oftentimes, because that individual has so integrated that as reality, I'll actually experience resistance from them. They'll actually say something to me like, that's not trauma though, or that doesn't mean that there's something wrong, or I just don't trust people. That's just how I am. And so we see that that experience becomes encoded upon us as a personality trait when it actually isn't. We begin to sort of, and when we actually begin to tell that story, right? I mean, because what other story am I going to tell? This is how I've protected myself, and it has kind of helped me to move on and sort of survive. And so it's very common for those individuals to begin to say, no, this is just who I am. I'm just the kind of person that doesn't talk to people. I just like to spend a lot of time by myself. I'm just that way. It's always interesting when we begin to unpack where some of those messages come from. So finally, if we take kind of that understanding of how the nervous system responds and in moments of stress and how stress can become trauma, we kind of have a pretty good thesis for how racialized trauma is also trauma. Let me back up for a moment to really drive home the point of how trauma impacts mental health. And so going back to that scenario where I'm sitting with someone and we're working on sort of establishing that they are or have a lived experience of trauma, when I serve someone, I sort of put people through a battery of assessments that give me a lot of good information about what their mood is like day to day. Those individuals who say things like, I just don't trust individuals, also show me a higher level, for example, of anxiety, or maybe a higher level of depression. And so when we look at individuals who have adapted this way of being maybe more hypervigilant, less trusting, which when we're less trusting of other individuals, we don't want to be connected to others. And so withdrawn, and we all know human connection, how valuable human connection is. These individuals start to show mental health deficits or the impacts of their mental health, like increased anxiety, increased depression. And so now when we make that connection into racialized trauma, it's quite clear, right? If my lived experience was, well, I'm Black and my Black body is deviant because the standard that's been set by the culture that I live in is the white body is standard and superior, then that's a trauma that I carry through every experience that I live through.
That's great, Kathleen. That's great. I have so many questions for you.
I'd be very, very curious for us to kind of go into that, if that feels okay.
Yeah. Because one of the first things that came to mind as you were sharing was Resma Manikin's quote, where he says, Trauma decontextualized over time in a family can look like family traits. Trauma decontextualized in a people can look like culture. And then I think he has another one that he says trauma decontextualized in an individual looks like personality.
Personality.
Personality. So I was wondering if you can unpack that a little bit more.
I love this quote so much. And quietly, I was searching for it as I was talking because I wanted to quote it, but I couldn't remember it. And I know I was going to mess it up. So thank you so much for finding that. Um, it's what I love about that quote and what I love about Resmaa Menakem's work. It's worth naming. Resmaa Menakem is a licensed therapist, but also a speaker and author in the space that does incredible trainings on anti-racist work. His style of doing them, which I value and I appreciate greatly, is by putting individuals in cohorts according to their lived experience, white-bodied individuals, black-bodied individuals, bodies of culture. And it really is generative of some really wonderful critical work in the space of trauma healing around race. So going back to this quote, I love this quote because this quote appreciates context. Some of the critical conversations I've had with individuals who struggle to understand racialized trauma, when we really get down to the bottom of it, they struggle to understand context. And that's part of privilege, right? Privilege sort of sways us or lulls us into this lie that context doesn't matter because, again, the white body is superior. And if I'm white bodied, then I don't have to, why do I have to think about my context? Things just are, right? But here in this quote, Resmaa Menakem invites us to consider context, I think. And so when we strip context, so this idea of decontextualize, when we strip context from something, we can very easily misname it, right? And so if I've gone through a traumatic experience and I've codified that experience without its context, right? Going back to my conversation about the parent who's an alcoholic and the child who became an adult, perhaps who adopted an orientation of less trust for individuals, without the context of that alcoholic parent, this person is just not trusting, right? And then we can go ahead and diagnose them with all types of mental health disorders that don't really get to that point, that this child learned this when they were in a very vulnerable stage of their lives, right? Because when we think about childhood, infancy, our brains are highly plastic, and then in adolescence, our brains are highly plastic. These are probably two of the most, science has shown, two of the most prominent areas in our development where we're highly susceptible to positive changes and negative changes. So this individual has codified this as normal. And if I don't contextualize that this person had an alcoholic parent, then I'm just talking about something that is, my north is completely messed up. My true north is messed up. I'm not really appreciating what happened to them and how that happening gave information to their experience. And that information created who they feel like they ought to be, the story of who they are. Oftentimes when I work with individuals and they carry those types of stories, I'm just not trusting. I just don't like people. When we really start to unpack it, they realize, oh my goodness, I did that to protect myself. I needed protection. And the best way that I did that was by really pushing people away, which on some level, I'm proud of that individual, right? Because they did that to survive.
Yeah, I think context is so important. And I think Resmaa and some of the folks who are doing the work of generational trauma, they begin with the context of colonialism, I think, right? Would you agree with this? The idea that these family traits, these personalities trait that we have inhabited that have actually, is creating some of the depression, creating some of the anxiety, creating some of the isolation. It can be traced not only from our experience, but from our parents' experience, from our parents' experience. And so I just little, even simple things. I remember when I came when I moved to North Carolina, my mom would tell me, don't tell people that you're from Miami. Tell people you're from Miami Springs. Like that was gonna be better. You know, my mom was like, that's gonna be better. But this idea that she felt like she needed to teach me that I needed to hide a certain part of who I was. And that's trauma because of what she experienced. And then I think about what my grandparents experienced in Venezuela. And so I kind of like that's my question for you is what is step one? Because I want my friends of color, my clergy friends especially, to come to this realization with me that we are experiencing generational trauma and we're carrying in our bodies. And in my opinion, it starts with colonialism, and that has gone untreated. And now it's not letting us be our true selves in our workplace, especially in a 90% white denomination. And so for me, for my question for you is what is step one for somebody to come to the realization?
So just wanting to affirm, I hear what you're saying around the impact of generational trauma. Um, I don't know where some of your listeners sit on this, but I believe that is actually factual. Um, Trauma lives in our bodies and lives and we carry sometimes nations of people who have endured traumatic experiences. Um, and so your question is, what's step one when we think about like how do we organize and have this conversation? I'm going to do my best here, okay? Because this is a really powerful conversation. I want to name this is a powerful conversation. This is also a violent conversation, and it feels important for me to say that. Um, I wish for I wish for I wish for organizations and cultures to provide an opportunity for individuals to have space to share and talk about their experiences with individuals who have also had those experiences. I wish for cultures and organizations to understand the Black body experience is so different from the white body experience. And if we keep ignoring that, we are denying truth. I think I think that gives us a better opportunity at having individuals to first share their experiences, find community in that shared experience, engage in deep trauma healing, right? Because part of when we think about how we heal trauma, we have to establish safety, but part of it is creating new communities, right? Setting limits and saying, hey, gosh, I realized there's a bigness to me that I didn't appreciate before. And that those parts of me need to be seen and heard and met, right? That's the human experience. Um, yeah, that's my deep wish here is that we could commit to something like that. And it's gonna get hard. And when it gets hard, keep committing. I've not encountered anything that was worth it in my life that didn't challenge me.
No, I love that idea of just creating new communities, more spaces for people of color to share their experiences, um, bring into light the fact that the Black body experience is different than the white body experience, and even the brown body experience is different than the Black body experience, and so forth, right? But, but one of the things that came to mind is trust. Trust. How do we create new communities for people of color and say, hey, you can trust this new community we're creating when we have been feeling so um unsafe for so long,
Mm.
because I can imagine just some of my colleagues who are older African American, and I say, hey, I'm going to create this new community, come. They're not going to trust the system that has failed them. So how do we build that trust? Can we build that trust?
So two questions come up for me. First is a recognition that you talked about building trust with people who were failed. I wonder how much acknowledgement is done there. And the second question is, how do you build trust? How is trust built? Is
Yeah, I think those are great. Great.
so that if we talked about it, how does one build trust? Do we know? Are we on the same page about that?
Takes time, right?
Mhm.
Relationships,
Consistency. You have to be
consistency.
accountable. I have
Mhm.
to know your boundaries and I have to know my boundaries.
I gotta know
Have
who's
all,
around.
yeah, right? Have
Mhm.
all those things been established if we're talking about building trust?
Yeah, I just have in mind, my colleagues who I want to create spaces like that because they weren't available for me, but I can see the distrust. I can see that they won't trust the new guy coming in and trying to do something new.
Mhm.
So I think allies are important too. So
Mhm.
that I partner with a member in the community who has built their trust and they can affirm that what we're doing is good. Because also I found that some of this conversational trauma is kind of new in some ways, especially racialized trauma. And so past generations have been trying to do work that is similar. We're just putting new language to it. Because I was
Mm.
talking to a colleague the other day and she said, "Oh, I've been doing something like, but I'm not calling it that." You see? So yeah, no, I appreciate that idea about trust. You want to share anything more on that topic? Because I have another question I want to ask you.
Yeah, yeah. So just wanting to like really center what I heard you describe. You described distrust existing and you described people feeling failed. And it really ignites in me the wondering, what does it take to meet those people? What does it take to, just really establish connection, contact with those who are failed? What would it mean, for example, to validate that experience? I see that you feel like this system, organization, culture has failed you. You know, if it's appropriate, can do you and there's that context of relationship and willingness, and both parties have resource, right? The person who is sharing feels like they're not having to labor, and the person who's listening is feeling like they're not going to have to jump into defensiveness. Can there be some story sharing between, so that whoever wants to know what the distrust is about can really appreciate what that is. This is about seeing, right? I think I'm I'm fortunate that we're having this conversation. This conversation is also about seeing. Um, I think that's one thing that I'd really like to drive home to your listeners.
No, I appreciate that. Another question for me on the topic is kind of a question for white bodies or on the topic of white bodies. And that is specifically um, thinking about how can we talk to white bodies so that they can understand that there needs to be new communities built for people of color to have this shared experience. Can we do that in such a way where they don't feel isolated or that they don't feel defensive, or almost to say that there are some conversations that people of color just need to have by themselves? Like, how can we be in a community together and still create these BIPOC communities, these safety nets,
Mm,
but still be in community with not just white bodies, but white bodies who are the leaders of the systems.
mhm.
So kind of a lot of questions there. But
Yeah.
what do you think?
So this question makes me wonder what the trust level is by the white bodies that, right, are in leadership, and so what can we name some of that comes up for them, right? Can that conversation be had? Can we just sort of address it if that opportunity exists? I don't know. I do want to say, um, we've always, organizations, agencies, for as long as I can remember in my professional career, have had diversity initiatives. Some organizations have formal D&I offices. Um, since 2020 and since the racial unrest in this country, I have seen more normalizing of BIPOC only spaces. I think that was a push forward. I think we should keep pushing forward in that direction, because what I've seen happen in that is Black people, and so BIPOC is Black, Indigenous, people of color, and so in this we're seeing Black bodies, with brown bodies or bodies of culture. But as we look at that delineation between white bodies or white people and BIPOC people, in those organizations that have really been, vanguard pushing that initiative forward to really secure those spaces for BIPOC people, I mean, you can probably read Forbes or Time magazine or whatever major organization is reporting what has come out of that. I would really invite leaders who are struggling with if this is a good idea to really look at what some of these vanguard organizations have done and how that has, what that has created for them. In general, when I look at these initiatives, you have employees, members of whatever that organization is, who are far more content, who feel more seen, who know, well, I have a space where I can voice. Now, if that space executes on those initiatives, that's a whole nother conversation. But if it is truly a space that was created to engage certain initiatives, when that office exists, it provides an opportunity, but it also shows the employees or the individuals who are part of that organization, it shows a level of trust, right? Wow, if a D&I office exists, or if we're having intentional conversation or intentional spaces with BIPOC people, the people who are sort of in leadership understand me. They understand me as a Black bodied person minimally, to know that my experience is different from those who are part of the organization who are white bodied.
And what do we do about the naysayers? What do we do about the people who, make comments like, you feel oppressed? Why? It's 2023. Like slavery's not happening anymore. Colonialism's not happening anymore. What about the naysayers? People who just miss it, don't believe even racism is a thing. How do we deal with them?
Do you want to know my actual opinion?
Yes, of course.
I don't give those people time. Look, we are at a stage in our history in the United States, and our stage in our history as a culture, where we understand that racism exists. And if I met you and you could honestly tell me that you were not impacted by racism at all, I would very, very honestly and very curiously ask you, how did you pull that off? That's how deep racism is in the water.
That reminds me of one of my professors, seminary, and I asked him the same question. And he said, just focus on the young people. He said, just focus on young people. He said, I don't even talk to those people no more. So he's,
Erwin, I got to be honest with you. As a Black-bodied woman, I don't have the that's labor for me. I don't have the time. I don't have the attention. If you honestly can look me in the eye and say racism is not real, I'm going to back away from you. And I think, and I'm saying that with intention, because that might be what some of us need to do. Let's not give all this attention to naysayers and burn what is sort of our time, our duty as individuals. Reach the people that you can. Have those critical conversations with individuals that you care about and that you love. You will be better for it too. But if I take a crusade and wage a war against individuals who are actually committed, Erwin, to misunderstanding me, I have to be prepared for what that's going to offer me at the end.
well, I have in mind my clergy friends of color. Okay. I have them in mind. And remember, we're in a denomination that is 90% white. And a lot of them are serving white churches. And I worry about them. I worry about them because I worry about myself, because I know the charge or the sensations that I feel when I'm mainly around white spaces. I know. And so my question for you is, do you have any word of encouragement or any word of hope or any next steps for clergy, specifically in the United Methodist Church, who are serving in this context? Anything you would want to encourage them with?
Absolutely. You have needs too. Your needs are valid. You are not deviant. If you are feeling like you are not met in your role, I invite you to consider that, gosh, maybe this container, I need to be kind of thinking about other ways to get those needs met. Um, you're on the front lines doing very, very hard work. You deserve time and attention, and you deserve to be met as well. And there are spaces for you. In fact, I would invite, if any of those clergy were listening and wanted to just connect with me and talk about resources, I'm totally open. Um, I give you the permission to include some of my contact information in your podcast notes, if that helps. Um, let me say this one more thing. Much where I'm located is in a space of healing for people, bodies of culture, bodies of color, right? That's where I'm located, and um, in order to heal, we have to establish safety. And sometimes we don't get that permission in every space that we occupy. And so it becomes incumbent upon us to establish that in some way, because that's what we need. We can establish safety by making intentional communities where people can hear our story. We can choose to start therapy. We can join an intentional group that centers these types of conversations. You and I named Resma Menachem earlier. He runs a ongoing cohort that centers this types of conversation. So I would just encourage um, those leaders in your organization who are struggling to consider that, because that can be a really, really valuable asset when you're doing this kind of work.
And I also just want to bring to light the fact that the United Methodist Church in Florida has a scholarship for counseling. I believe it's about $600 that they provide clergy if you apply, so that you can get some counseling. And
That's
like I'm
amazing.
like I mentioned, Kathleen, she's my counselor, and she's been helping me dig deep into some of these things, and I highly recommend her. Um, and we will be sure to share that information with you in our next newsletter. I want to shift the conversation now to the younger generation, because I work with Generation Z, and we'll end with this. What what would you encourage um, in Generation Z? Like, I'm thinking about our college students, specifically college students of color, BIPOC college students. What kind of work should they be doing in college? Like, what do you wish you would have been doing in college in terms of coming to grips with racialized trauma?
That's a wonderful question. Well, if I go back to my experience, I wish I had an opportunity to develop intentional community, intentional containers that can hold these kinds of conversations. Um, the body of color and the body of culture experience, like you've named, is to subvert, right? That's why we engage in code switching, right? I speak to white bodied people in one way and I speak to my friends in another way. It's this very intentional act of subversion, right? And this is a survival negotiation. Um, and so when we put ourselves in communities where people can hold us, people can take the wide range of who we are, we can achieve better wellness there. And so if I were to sort of go back in time, I would have been more intentional about creating those communities. I also would have been more intentional and careful about the boundaries I set with people who could not understand my experience, and what types of conversation and types of activity I engage in. Look, the reality is we are the collection of our lived experiences. And some of us have never had the experiences that others of us have had, right? A lot of that falls along the color line. And so if I were to go back, I would give myself permission to recognize that we're different. Our lived experiences are different. And that doesn't put me in a deviant space, that puts me in a different space from an individual who perhaps is white bodied. Maybe I have some points of connection as well, right? And I can sort of focus on those points of connection. And finally, I wish I had understanding of my own racial identity development as a younger person in my 20s. I'm Black bodied, but I'm also ethnically Haitian, which kind of puts me in a different kind of category than African American individuals who are Black bodied. And I think the discussion for me about where my racial identity is, my consciousness around my race, because I believe that that process was different for me being a Black bodied Haitian person living in America. I would have loved to have done some of that, because then that would have provided wonderful information and not made me feel strange, for example, for code switching, right? Or whatever it is, whatever subversive tactic I'm using to survive being in a predominantly white space, I would have gave myself less grief about that.
No, I think that's great. And that's some of the things that I'm doing now. I'm not in college, and to understand that process that we all go through and to be more aware of it. The little handouts you sent me were very, very helpful. Challenging. I was reading, I'm still mad at one of them, but very helpful. Very
Sorry,
helpful. Yeah,
Erwin.
no, it's all right. So many questions, but I know our time is over. Do you mind if I just ask you one more question? Just one more
Sure,
question.
and we can do a part two
Yeah,
if
we
this
should
feels
do a part two.
useful. Yeah, go ahead.
So my last question for you is, are there any signs that we should be paying attention to in the body that is our body crying out for help?
You know, this question can be answered in many ways. When I thought about this, I was like, are we talking about as an organization, we look like this and this is our red flags? Are we talking about individuals saying certain things?
I was thinking individual, but now that you brought up the system and of that larger piece, I would love for you to answer both.
Okay. So I'm actually going to pull from a researcher by the name of Dr. Brene Brown. Dr. Brene Brown is a white-bodied female who studies vulnerability and shame. They have a really great book called Dare to Lead that talks about wonderful leadership. I think it's something that if you're like in your 20s, 30s, and you're thinking about, I think anybody should read it, but particularly, I know we did some focusing on Gen Z and younger individuals. I think it's worth reading. In that book, she talks about, gosh, I sort of lost my train of thought. Okay, got it. So she talks about, the whole book is about creating a culture of well-led people, right? Making space for different ideas, these types. She doesn't center on race, but that's kind of what the book is about. She talks about signs of a culture where people don't feel seen or heard. And one of the things that she talks about is the meeting after the meeting. Do you know what I'm talking about? So if you don't know what I'm talking about, the meeting after the meeting is sort of a phenomenon that occurs generally in workspaces where maybe a superior, boss, whomever will hold a meeting. The meeting lasts a period of time where certain directives are given. Everybody's quiet. Maybe people had an opportunity to share their opinions, but generally in these types of settings, they probably didn't. And if they did, they didn't feel safe enough to share as a group with the supervisor. And then after the meeting concludes, those individuals, usually without the supervisor, meet and talk about how they really felt about everything. This is the meeting after the meeting. This is an example of back channeling. This is a situation that's rife with gossip. You don't want this if you can avoid it. The reality is many organizations, this is standard. I've worked in many places where this happened probably as standard practice. Sometimes I thought the supervisor knew that it was happening, but they just felt sort of helpless to keep it from happening. And so when we see that occurring with individuals, we have to wonder, are individuals feeling heard? Are individuals feeling safe? Are individuals feeling like this is their space too? So I would be looking for that. and when we're looking at individual behavior.
And what about in the individual?
Or in the big culture, you mean?
No, I felt like you were talking about like one of the signs of
Mhm.
trauma or not being heard or not being seen are the meetings after the meeting. And that's for the body, the large body. But what about for the individual? I know you mentioned a little bit like anxiety. I know I feel it, or even the folding, you spoke about it a little bit. The oh no, the
Flooding,
fonding,
flooding, fawning. Yes,
fonding, yeah,
fawning.
yeah.
That's,
But
mhm.
but I was just wondering if there's any more signs that we've been ignoring, where it's been our actual bodies telling us you need to go get some help.
Yeah,
Racialized trauma is real and you need to get some help.
right. So yeah, I like what you did there around this is kind of organizational. Now that we're kind of identified that, I see that as both that back channeling and gossip, it kind of is systemic, and then it is behaviors that individuals engage in. But if we truly talked about individuals, just to kind of go back to that fawning behavior, um, so right, if let's just kind of break this down very general, and include fawning in that. Let's imagine for a moment that an individual, two parties are talking to one another, or maybe there's a directive, there's a directive that has been given by an organization, and individuals are expected to um, sort of execute that directive. Let's imagine that an individual is Black bodied or a body of culture, and they very clearly can see that this is a microaggressive directive, right? It doesn't support me. It seems like it's completely tone deaf when we look at race, and the individual starts to feel oppressed by this. What we can expect to see is some hypervigilance, is some anxiety. This individual is probably taking more mental health days off. Um, but at the same time, this individual is probably looking around for people who are safe, because you got to remember, this is a directive that came down from upon high. And so when things like that happen, people are like, who's safe? If one person made a rule, then I can identify that that one person is not safe, or that branch is not safe. But if it comes down as a directive, this microaggressive directive, that individual is going to feel hyper vigilant. The person who is sort of the oppressed individual is going to feel hyper vigilant and on guard. Then this is where we see fawning behavior happen, because in order to do my job, I have to show up as not true, right? And so maybe I'm smiling excessively, or maybe trying to shore up relationships, but at the same time, I'm experiencing an incredible amount of stress. A key way that I've seen this happen in organizations is people smiling. And this is interesting how this goes down, because it's like, I'm the oppressed person and I'm smiling, but I might be also engaging in the back channeling behavior. And to the exterior, who doesn't appreciate that I'm sort of dealing with this microaggressive directive as an employee, you might think, oh, she's being fake. Here she is smiling in my face. And then I heard that this is going on in the back, right? Because again, I'm trying to sort of negotiate that dissonance in that moment. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, it does. And honestly, you already answered it when you were talking about the fight, flight, freeze, fonding, flooding. So you already answered it with that. Well, okay, let's end our podcast here, and hopefully we'll have a part two. And for everybody who's listening to this, we will follow up with Kathleen's information. We're also going to follow up with an infographic that she sent us, so that you can continue to raise your awareness on racialized trauma. We want to highlight that we are working on a racial trauma retreat, hopefully for 2023 or 2024. If you're interested in that, please feel free to email me. And we're so thankful that you were with us today, that you took time to listen. And I really pray and hope that you would find some healing, that we would all find some healing from some of this racialized trauma. You want to leave us with any closing words, Kathleen?
Yeah, thank you so much for this. This has just been such a treat to be here with you and to have this conversation. And once again, Erwin will have my contact information. If you or someone you care about feels like you want to get started with therapy to address racialized trauma, please, let's connect. I'd love to hear your story and see how I can help.
Awesome. Thank you, Kathleen, and thank you to everybody who's listening today.